Hello and welcome to the Annie Altman Show, the podcast, Season 5. Welcome to the 6th episode in the Communication C series. Today I am here for the second time, with Lauren Traitz. Lauren, I love you. I'm so excited for this episode. Lauren is an associate LMFT licensed marriage and family therapist with Angela Psychology Group. Lauren is a poet and generally a badass human, and I'm really jazzed for this episode and communicating about not communicating. And what are the parts of communicating that are nonverbal, that are pauses, the poetry, the dance, the play, the clusterfuck mindfuckery of talking about not talking. So here we go. Thanks for being here listening. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. And one quick addendum, which is that I'm not licensed yet. I mean, I have an associate number, and so I'm on my track to licensure. And that's a nod to future Lauren once she's accomplished. But yeah, it's so good to be here. And it's such a stark moment because the last time we did this, we were together in person and sharing air safely, we think, and feeling each other's presence. And we were kind of disembodied voices together in our bodies, and now our bodies are showing up, but we're an ocean apart. So I'm really feeling the oddity and the kind of wonder and strangeness of being close to you and far at the same time.
I feel close to you with your poetry and those words and that describing and being transported back to the kitchen, my kitchen in West Hollywood, and I can so picture sitting at the table with you and drinking kombucha, and our first episode talking about emotions as information and
those pesky things.
Oh, those pesky things. Those are so fun and so pesky at the same time, and you're a great person to get to understand and sit with them with. And now, yeah, here we are. It's so weird and so cool that we can talk over video chat, and I'm, touching a screen. Hey, Lauren's face on a screen.
Hi, Annie. And you brought up the oddity of talking about not talking or talking about what isn't yet given language to, or maybe even possible to give language to. And so, yeah, this will be a fun kind of feeling into a space and trying to give words to things that are pretty wordless, which is kind of the quest of the poet and the therapist, but also like an impossible journey, right? You're constantly frustrated in either because you can only get close to the thing, and we never quite wrap language around it, which is also wonderful because it means that we get to have a living relationship with whatever it is, whether it's a relationship with another person or with ourselves. So let's see what we can say about not saying stuff all the time.
I'm glad you brought up that paradox for you personally, and that's why I'm especially jazzed on this episode as someone also with the awareness of it, so we can move past that conversation to the next one, of your love of words in so many senses and in so many different practices, that then getting your perspective on not words and the space between words and the pauses and the timing of words and the order, and also sitting with that paradox of the word asymptotes coming to mind, where we can get closer and closer and closer, and we're still wave from afar. I feel like you've been a word person your whole life in some ways, like from what I know of you.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have been attributed to a few annoying complete sentences at the age of 2, so I'm sure and most of them related to trying to reconcile pain between my parents. So I think that sort of bridge role, mediator role, and also, yeah, being able to kind of give words to things has always been a part of me. And, you know, poetry, which I started writing in full earnest. I mean, I wrote little poems throughout a lot of my life, but I started writing with regularity when I was like a preteen, I believe. And I have been writing poetry ever since. And I think that is representative much more of that threshold that we're kind of talking about today, where I am curious about, intimidated by, excited by, interested in, where language reaches out its kind of fingers, and it really only touches the thing, and doesn't quite capture it. And so in a way, I mean, a lot of the mentors and guides that I've had have talked about the work that we're interested in doing, the research we're interested in doing is so often linked to our own growth edges and the things we're kind of seeking for our own healing. And whereas language is something that I can feel a lot of comfort with, silence, not speaking, um, not rushing to give words to something is often a lot harder and increasingly a part of the work that I'm doing. So I must, at the very least, I am evidence that we are interested in working with the areas that we most want to grow. So, yeah.
I'm reminded of a poem of yours with a line, something about brushing up against the edge of mystery, and also a line you said on the first podcast in a similar feeling that gave words to this feeling that I hadn't had words for, where and sense the edge or feel the edge and make contact with it, and it's still there. One of the other things that I thought about when you were sharing that, and first also I so admire your vulnerability to go a little bit into stream of consciousness, which is a big piece for me of this podcast, and letting it be a safe place for the whole spectrum of both pauses and people saying, oh, I don't know, let me think about that, and just have a moment of silence here while recording, and also the place for stream of consciousness and no pause and letting whatever comes out come out. And I really admire that you're open to do that, and you being someone who so immediately understood and felt my intentions with this podcast as a place to do that, and a place to say, hey, you're a human, so come on and be a human, which in my experience encompasses both of those extremes. And the other piece that came up of hearing your sharing of the going back to, for all of the Freudian things that are like, dude, you were doing a lot of cocaine. There's also a lot of Freudian things of, yeah, a lot of stuff does come from childhood and those first experiences. And I'm picturing little Lauren there, this tool of words being like, and I resonate with it too, being
I can save my family, I can save the world. Yes. Yeah.
And words can, to some capacity, or in my experience, part of saving anything, part of this humaning thing is words. And also the paradox of they're just one thing, and how can it be both at the same time, Lauren? How?
That is, oh man, it's one of those unanswerable questions, which, like, thank goodness, because otherwise all of us would be missing something. And instead it's just the way it is, that we don't, it's a conversation. It's like, it's exactly what we're talking about, where as soon as we pin it down with language, it doesn't quite capture it. It like wriggles out again of our grip. Before we move on though, I do want to call you out in response to calling me out, because you had to create the container and the space for this to happen, and for me to get to show up as so many different parts of myself, which is rare. We often are presenting one face, and it's, I think what's unique, and I said it in our last recording about what you're doing, is trying to have people's humanity be itself a resource and kind of worthy of being shared. And it's so funny because it's a great example of something that, you communicating in a way that, for example, a therapist aims to communicate by creating an environment, a container of meaning around something that then gets to be filled by whichever person you're talking to. And so you're not saying, here's what it is to be human. You're asking a question and then carving out a space that can be filled with all number of things. And that, I think, is one of the things that maybe one of the tales we're maybe chasing around the bend today, is how can we wield language in a way that opens for all kinds of different communications to come in and out, versus wielding language, not that it's a binary, but versus wielding language, sometimes it can have this really exacting kind of tightening, narrowing, pin it down effect. And sometimes that's really important, but sometimes it also can create a lot of pressure on us to say or do or be a singular or right thing. And it can also block our capacity to remain open and aware to all other kinds of communications, whether it's, scents on the wind from other species, or whether it's something someone is not quite saying in a relationship, but they're doing, and you're getting a feeling about what that might mean. There's all kinds of ways that we're receiving information, our emotions being one of them. See our last podcast episode. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think you're doing
that with call out. Like if that was a call out, that was a very kind reflecting of this podcast and our podcasting and talking again. And or maybe the call out was being like, Annie, you're making a therapist, or you're making like a podcast attempting to be podcast therapy, or that is a form of podcast therapy without podcast therapy licensure. And I'm not a therapist, and this is very different from a therapy project also, in that this is intended to be shared and heard by someone. There's meant to be a pause and a space for a third party here to be hearing this and participating in their own way with this, whereas in a one-on-one talk therapy, it's meant to be only in that container. Also, there are such big overlaps of make the space, and also make the space for the dance of both, of sometimes too on the podcast and in talk therapy, of it getting really specific and pinning down, like, well, what did you mean by that exactly? What's really coming up here? What's at the root of this thing?
Yes.
Without it being this, it's again the paradox I'm feeling of there aren't binaries and there are binaries. And in this reality of it is, you say words or you don't say words, that's a yes or a no of the speech. And also there's all of these complexities in there that thank Jeebus for poetry and art to make art and things out of it, rather than feeling restricted by it, in my experience.
Yeah, I think you're naming something really important when you talk about that paradox. In therapy work, you were kind of brushing on it, but sometimes we are kind of after something, and we are looking to kind of uncover something and shine that light in, and then other times there is a bit more of a poetic quality to doing therapy. And you even kind of talked about how this isn't therapy, but there's a blurriness there about, well, then what really is this, and why would we even be able to make that association unless there was some resonance? And the resonance that I feel is creating the space for curiosity, creating, like, we've carved out this hour with the intention to pause and look at something and say, like, what is this? What is this?
Pause.
And that's what I think. Are you pausing me, or are you pointing out
I'm pausing you, because then of course between the two of us we were like, let's talk about pausing and creating intentional spaces to pause.
Mm-hmm. There's our paradox again. And I'm really becoming quite convinced that if you felt something paradoxical emerge, that you are at a trailhead for something true. So very much encouraging opening when you feel paradox instead of constricting around, okay, one or the other of these is real and true and the other one needs to be pushed out. Because I think that when that kind of narrowing happens, we can feel really overwhelmed, we can feel really panicked, because a whole part of us or a whole part of reality is kind of on the chopping block there. And fortunately, things are just so much more complex, which means that our intellect runs into paradox all the time, because in reality, things are so complex. But so we're talking about pausing, right? And you're kind of laughing at, and I think rightfully so, that we're talking about silence and pausing. But at its heart, I think what I mean is that when we don't rush to give language to something, or to speak, or to respond, or to act, and we allow for there to be a moment, a space, whether that's in ourselves, so an intense emotion comes up, or someone says or does something and we feel something. I mean, it puts a feeling, it invokes a feeling in us, like there's a membrane in the relationship and they've just kind of prodded at something. These are communications, either from within or without. And we have an opportunity, if we give ourselves a moment and we don't feel like we have to immediately respond, to get information from those interactions and to shape, like there's sometimes it's relieving and wonderful to just free associate the way you're talking about. And then sometimes we want to create a poetry with the way we're communicating. I might want to be quiet while you're sharing something that's attached to grief or intensity for you, even if it's my impulse, and everything in me wants to reassure you and tell you it's going to be okay, and tell you about all the times that I also felt that, or whatever might be coming up. And yet, what am I communicating by just being with you without saying a thing? Now, it could mean so many different things depending on who you are, but some of the things it often means are, keep going, I'm here, I think you've got this, I'm just here to witness you. So there's just so much that is communicated without saying something, and that is so hard for me, and also so critical to the work that I'm doing with people. So much of my job is not saying something and studying what's coming up in me as information rather than just acting on it.
It's funny to me too that from my perspective, I see you as someone who is skilled and practiced because you practice the pause. And then noticing and seeing that classic human tendency to, like, I need to learn this thing more, I need to be able to do this thing more. And
therapists are prey to this too. We all are, right? I think you're right. There's that urge, that feeling of like, I have to.
Yeah, which sometimes I'll reflect and then I'll be like, careful with this one, Annie, of boiling all feelings down to a binary too. Like, yeah, there's the emotion wheel, and then also there's this binary of this feels good or this feels not good. And it can be different in different times of what it is. And there can also be the feeling of opening and closing, which can be useful at different times, of opening to the mystery. And also you could open to the pursuit of where the fuck did that reaction just come from? Or where did that impulse come up to have that reaction? And a lot of this practice for me and for what I was hearing and you're sharing about it is distinguishing and differentiating, and the practice of is this the practice of communicating as an art form, and is this the moment to say this? Is this the moment to say this? And is this a time to say, you know, is someone, it's like the classic, like, hey, do you just want to vent, or do you want to problem solve here? Like, before going in, what is your intention in this conversation? Friend who's calling, who's feeling stressed, like, what are you looking for here? How can I support you? And the other, I'm in like free association a little bit here. The other thing that came up in my head was stuff of women's circles, and that I've participated in, with the basis of intentionally crafting a space where someone shares whatever they want to share, and no one says a damn thing. No one says a word. There's no response. There are no questions asked. No one compares their life story to it or says, oh my God, that resonates with me so much, which can be beautiful to hear. And also, the first time I participated in a space where, and also for me as that caretaker, helper, people pleaser part, where then it gave me the space to really be there emotionally in a different way, rather than feeling like, oh, I need to make sure I verbalize to this person, like, I hear you, I've had this experience, I hear you, that sounds really hard, tell me more, let me ask these questions.
Oh, that Annie, that second part is, I mean, so much resonates. But I do think you bring up something really important, especially for those of us who can relate to that caretaking urge, which is that sometimes it feels like we need to say something in order for the person to know that we're with them or we're there. Or, you know, you get an alarming text message from someone, let's say, and it feels like if you don't respond right away, relationship is on the chopping block. Like, there's this urgency, this feeling of like, if I don't have the words right now, then something's going to be lost. Something's going to be broken. Something's going to be dropped. And there is a little bit of that kind of riskiness and realness and rawness to letting things hang sometimes. And it can be really scary to trust that, and to trust that the other person can know that we're, and then sometimes, like you're saying, in some of the women's circles we've both participated in, it's amazing how holding that silence can actually be. And that's the other part of what I thought you were saying so beautifully, is that one of the amazing things about communicating with silence is it gives room for things to arise, things to emerge. You know, if I don't kind of, I mean, I just did it now, you were riffing and then I riffed on you, and it's beautiful. We are where we are, and we have this rhythm between us. And then if we drop into a pocket where it's quiet for just long enough, something might bubble up. And that's another idea I've been thinking about a lot, is, and this is another C word for you, but the idea of charge, right? Letting charge build, letting it build, like letting longing and uncertainty build, letting it go a little bit past where we're comfortable. And we often want to reassure and to rush in and to see what happens with that energy between you and someone else. Scary, real, and sometimes like you could have never, it's outside of what you would have given words to a few moments ago. It gives words to itself. See your facial reactions, there's so much quiet and yet visually loud information and communication you're giving me, and I know you're with me. I know you're with me.
I'm here. I know you're here too. It's nice. It's beyond nice. It's settling and exciting at the same time to have. That was part of me getting so jazzed, and then also feeling this comfortable jazzed about this episode with you, and the trust word, the vulnerability word, which is a related word, of letting go of that fix it need and that problem solving need, is a lot of it in my personal experience. That problem solver caretaker will let me do and have action on this, and the urgency of it, and trusting that we're not going to get it wrong, that we're going to have a fun podcast, that this podcast will reach who it's meant to reach, and it will help in all the things, and I can say things sarcastically until I learn to say them seriously, and all of it can unfold in its timing because it already is. And that the general sort of okayness that, again, I feel like is a really common base of all therapeutic practices, and connecting in that own sort of therapy of connecting with people who you know and love, where there is like breathing room being a phrase for a reason, and the spiritual scientific overlap of atoms needing and being mostly space, and there being that space for the magic. Because again, sarcastically, and I really do mean
Unironically, magic. And poetry's like that too, since we're talking about these parallels, is
totally
a
you're
stark
using
shape
words,
and it's a sculpture. It's whereas with prose, which still is, everything that's said is also reflects all the things that aren't said or weren't chosen, just like all the choices that we make in life are also composed of all the things we turn away from. But with poems, there's this visual component, almost like a word sculpture, where you can see the negative space around the language. And sometimes as a poet, you jump a stanza, or you put a word far out in the opposite side of the page so that the gap speaks something, or rather than speaking something here, drops you into a sensation, into a feeling. And I think even in our conversation today, as we've been sinking in and settling and getting more comfortable, you can notice each of us are slowing our rhythm, and there's that feeling of like you take a step and you're kind of feeling out what the next step is, and it feels more of an experience rather than something we're talking about, something we're kind of talking the way you might touch something. You're using the words to touch. I also really quickly, and maybe we can come back around to it, but want to speak to the allowance side of it too. So it's not just about what you give with your silence, it's also about getting to take silence, getting to take pause for yourself. And I had a recent interaction with someone sending something that was really evocative and intense for me to receive. And that urgency came up, that feeling of like, I need to respond, and that was kind of the point of it, right? The point of it was to be like, this is important, pay attention. And it succeeded at that. And I knew that in that state of being kind of reactive and being overwhelmed with the feeling, that it wouldn't do justice to my feelings to suddenly make them be able to perform intellectually with language. And nor would I really get to make such an informed choice about what move I made in that relationship if I had. And sometimes we don't have that choice. Sometimes we do have to react, and that's where there's room, and hopefully should be room, for you to make mistakes. I mean, relationships that are strong, I think, can tolerate us misstepping and stepping on each other's toes and getting in real-time feedback of like, ow, no, and getting to make adjustments. We should, we benefit from practicing communicating that and receiving those communications. But it was so needed for me to say, I got your message, I'm going to respond to it. I'm having a strong reaction, I'm going to take a little bit of time to respond. And just carving out that space and giving myself that space so that I could feel what I was feeling, and the way that I viewed that communication after I had a chance to be with my own emotions, and to consider what the person was not just saying with their words, but saying with the way they communicated to me. I was able to respond from such a deeper connective place with myself and with them, and it allowed us to move forward and not get stuck there. And it was gentler on me that I didn't have to perform right away. I could actually retreat for a little bit. That's important, I think, for us to be able to have.
the advocating for ourselves And I'm wondering how much pausing, and I'm thinking about meditation and yoga and journaling and one-on-one therapy and dance, music, all of writing therapies where we're giving ourselves the pause and the carve out space to be with ourselves and to sit with all the conditioning that says, oh, you're selfish, you're a bad person, you're needy, you're worthless, you're unworthy, all of the list of things that come up that say, for whatever reason, like you said with allowance, like I'm not allowed to take that space.
Yeah.
That then, in my experience, get taken out on other people in ways that ends up being harmful for everyone, which is part of the whole it being beneficial to other people logically to take care of yourself rather than to put them ahead of yourself and then hold that against them and harm both of you more, which I'm repeating continuously as I continue practicing embodying that experientially rather than knowing it in my head and still wanting to put on my savior complex people pleasing hat. And how to of course this therapy thing too is getting so much to really what I view as the root of therapy, which is the I am worthy mantra. In however that feeling comes up, I'm allowed to exist, I'm allowed to be a human, I'm allowed to be here because I'm here, because this is happening. And then how that comes up in practices that on the surface are very simple, you know, sending an email, typing out 3 sentences of, hey, I got this email, I need some space so that I can react, so that I can respond rather than react. Or, you know, hey, I had a big reaction to this email, I need some space. And then to do that, and in actual practice, is so much more complicated. And I'm speaking from experiences where I did not do what you did and could have benefited both parties had I done that. And that's a powerful fucking practice. It's huge. It's a big, deep sitting with to say, to recognize the emotion and also to recognize that emotion of urgency and recognize the duality of time being real and time being not real at the same time. And privilege is really coming up for me here as a theme with time, and how we have privileges in different ways, and money and time are really huge pieces of that. And there being this validity and this lack of validity in people saying they don't have the money and time for things, and in different ways and similar ways, and that being really connected to privilege too. And this sort of capitalist and other programming that says you must do this thing on this timeline and it has to go fast and no rest and you must always be productive. And the it excites me. It excites for my getting to have like my science hat that wants proof and to see things tangibly, that one interaction, that one moment that you did of sending that email, that one feeling that one person gets hearing you talk about this on this podcast, are each another step towards prioritizing the experience and the being present for the experience over prioritizing the quote bottom line of dollars or time or whatever production related thing.
To have the room, and to the extent that you can, to give yourself the room. But then you also bring up something really important when it comes to the privileges that we have. And in some very obvious ways, there are individuals whose communications, their voices are not recognized or not heard or not responded to. And so to advocate for, you know, greater restraint or equanimity, I mean, might be completely inappropriate in those cases when, you know, if someone or some institution or some system is not responding to a communication of pain or a communication of something that feels needed or true for you as an individual or as a people, then it makes all the sense in the world for those communications to get louder, for the boundaries to get firmer. And then the other piece of privilege around here is like it is so challenging to take that second and to feel like we can afford it, especially if we grew up in homes where that wasn't something that was modeled or allowed. We had to speak right away. We had to explain ourselves right away. Being able to say, hey, I'm going to tap out for a moment and reflect on this is like radical in certain homes and communities and relationships, and can feel really threatening to some people if they are really overwhelmed with this feeling of like, I need something from you right now. And I think that's another part of it is when we're feeling cornered, sometimes we're cornered and we need to act. And sometimes it's good timing. Talk about nonverbal communication and being cornered. So yeah, sometimes we're cornered and we need to bark or, act and respond. And sometimes we feel cornered, and if we just don't realize we can take a second and move out of that corner. And so that's something I've been practicing a lot, the email being one example of that. But, is this urgency I'm feeling in the other person to get something from me, to release their own tension or anxiety, to play out some familiar interaction? Like, do I have to play into that right now? Or can I take a second and see what me, Lauren, is feeling is true and real and present? And often those are those moments where I think we can kind of shift the rules of engagement to be like, hey, I feel like every time this happens between the two of us, you do this and I do this, and then we're back in it again. And I don't want to keep engaging with you like this. I don't actually want this to be what our relationship is. And the only way that's possible is if we don't have to respond right away. Like, that is goodness, that should be woven into our civil rights. The right to like take a moment, the right to have a moment to reflect and not, I mean, the amount of, I think, conflict that could be circumvented on every level of scale if considered core to our rights as human beings and to the health of our relationships is being able to take a moment.
Goodness. I love that you said goodness. Yes. The breathing room, again, the take a moment, the pause, the giving the grace and the space to be a person, and to give to the time for reflecting and for connecting with yourself. And a lot of what I'd be curious to hear more of from what you were just sharing, because in the example you gave of coming back and talking to someone, you offered 2 I statements, which I know I've joked about with you before. And also, side note of like the women's circles and things that how cool is it that I've gotten to participate in women's circles you've hosted, and now we're getting to have this. And that was a tag from before.
Full circle.
I statements being maybe the only real communication that we have as humans, because we are all biased by our own perspective so deeply. And again, especially for that personality type with the tendency to lean into caretaking and over giving, it can be really easy to get confused about what are my I statements, rather than things that are other people's ideas or stories I'm telling myself about my obligations to other people. And so to have the space to come back into your own energy, both scientifically and spiritually, to reconnect with yourself and to communicate with yourself through that pause, to say, hey, Lauren, or hey, Annie, what's up here? What's going on? What do you need? What do you want? What's coming up for you? And the word too coming up here a lot is accountability.
Yeah.
The ownership of, this is my experience in my life and my choices with what I'm doing, and wondering too how much pauses are stepping into that, and all the things about saying a bunch, or
Please just give me a second. Yes. Yeah, and there's, I'm also now thinking, especially because when we started talking about privilege, we started brushing up against social and cultural issues as well. But there's a way that another form of communicating without really directly communicating is, how do we show up behaviorally, and how do we organize our businesses, our relationships, our justice system, our politic, and what is being communicated by those structures. And so much of what's being communicated is in the boundaries of what is or is not a part of it, is or is not acceptable, is or is not invited. And that's, again, where those like kind of thresholds between space and declaration are so much the way that we kind of understand where we are, who we are, what we are, and what's happening between us. And so, if in our relationships we're seeking to communicate to the other person, I would really like to communicate to this person that I'm genuinely receptive to hearing about how I'm affecting them, and to making sure my behavior does not create harm, and to getting to know them as a person, not just as someone who can fulfill something for me. Then, and we know that that's what we want to communicate, almost like environmentally, then we make all kinds of choices in alignment with that. And the communication isn't just about like, hey, Annie, top end, like, just want to say, like, you can hit me up for feedback. If I'd laid it out, there's a part of you might be like, oh, that's really cool. But it's still something that has to unfold and be demonstrated and communicated through behavior and rules of engagement. And then we have systems in place that are communicating a lot of the opposite, that are communicating, we don't want to hear from you. The impact on you personally is not as important as, profit or whatever it is. And how is that communication seeded into the environment and felt? And maybe it's not, and now there's so much work to give language to these things so that we can become aware. And that's where the incredible tool of language to bring awareness to it. It's sort of like the first explorers are the behavioral and the environmental and the nonverbal and the somatic. Like, we're getting all these signals, and we have some kind of unconscious awareness of what is being communicated, where the edges are with you, where the edges are with the system I'm in, the family I'm in. And then through giving language to it, which requires us to take that pause and reflect, but we can then become aware, and it gives us a different kind of apparatus, a different set of tools. So they all kind of feed into each other, these different levels of communication too. Yeah.
showing so much of the connection in all of this. And I'm glad you brought up too the impact of how the systems that we organize humanity under as humans communicate so much, and how much of feelings of unworthiness and inadequacy and all of these things are linked to messages people are receiving from their family systems, from their school systems, from our work systems, from all of these things, where, of course, in the US, people are going to have a very different relationship with their physical health if we are having insurance be tied to your job, and having things, not recognizing basic human needs as basic human rights is, of course, going to impact that is a communication to say that education isn't a basic human right and only these people get it, and we're going to make this a privilege. That is communicating something. And then that pattern can only be broken by communicating about how, well, hey, let's look at the demographics of who's getting to be educated and how that's impacting people and what we're doing here, and how we can look at this prison pipeline system, the education prison pipeline system, how we can look at the generations of people who are going to these elite universities and how those feed into jobs where those people can make millions and millions of dollars, and these cycles. And all of the ways that something I feel like that we are both in alignment with in our practices, and obviously no one's a perfect ally, and no one person is the person to communicate all the things or dismantle all the things or whatever it is. I'm reminding myself very much of, right? What a great load off that then we're each just one human doing our one human thing where, okay, on the podcast, how can I use this as a way to open up more space for more people to communicate a variety of backgrounds and experiences and perspectives? And your practice, how can you open up spaces one-on-one in the future of group therapy or whatever writing or other things that you do to open up more spaces to pass the literal microphone and share that communicating, have some people take a pause so it can be passed to someone else, and also address all of these things that at some point, and we're seeing that in some ways, there are spaces for pauses on a bigger systems level where that is more part of the cultural norm, that is more part of how things are for people to be upfront about what's going on and to communicate about it, and also the space to not communicate about it. No.
Don't worry, we're always talking about both. Can't get around that. No, but I think you're right. I think it is important to speak to that trend too, that there is a growing discourse and awareness around these things, and people are developing shared languages for advocating for space or for giving visibility to their experience. So that's an important part of our current story as well. I think, I feel like it's so funny because when you've really massaged something that feels paradoxical, it stops to feel so paradoxical. Like it starts to feel like the things just kind of sit side by side. And the thought I just had was communication starts with listening. It seems so simple, but how do you know what you're communicating or what needs to be communicated or what someone else is communicating if you don't listen first? And I think that's needed on every level. It's like soaking someone in an Epsom salt of attention. You know, it's like having so much of therapy is just feeling listened to. So much of friendship is feeling listened to. So much of being able to tolerate our emotions is listening to them. So much of being able to organize structures that honor people's needs and their dignity means listening to them. And I think that is a critical component of the negative space of communication. It's hearing first, listening first. And then sobbing and sobbing.
Listen, feel, pause, word. Yes, I'm really grateful for you bringing up that word and that using words to point at this part of the pause, which is hearing the act of holding the space for each individual and for whatever those individuals or group of individuals and something bigger are all communicating. And the intro song for this podcast is a prayer. The word means listen and hear that I have tattooed that is a reminder for me on my body to start there, and also to start with listening to myself and my own body so that I can actually authentically and effectively and lovingly listen to someone else and be there and listen to them how I listen to myself, and also be able to quiet myself fully to fully listen to them. And I love your poetic language of the Epsom salt bath.
The bath of attention.
Yes, and the validation of therapy and the tool of therapy of teaching someone how to listen to themselves, and also teaching them the safety of a relationship and what it feels like to be listened to and heard, to then carry that discernment with them into other relationships and into their own relating. And I'm saying they, and I'm meaning I only have I statements.
Yeah, I think you're saying that when you have felt it in a relationship, you then develop an awareness of that being something that is nurturing to you or needed by you, and then can be more discerning about finding it in others. And that, oh, that feels so, it both helps us hopefully have some compassion for why this can be so hard when we haven't experienced that. It can be so hard to even know that it's possible for us, or that we can give it. And then how healing it can be to just experience it without us having to like solve anyone's problems or fix anything. And then you said this other beautiful thing about someone getting to listen to themselves. And I think that that's a critical component too, is that, and it's something I certainly am learning in my work, and then also just in all my relationships, that if I hold and pause and give room, someone might work through something themselves, or they might find an unexpected part of themselves, or maybe they said something and I assume that they meant something or that they feel something about me, and it strikes me the wrong way. And if I can wait, it's going to resolve itself. You know, they're going to come to some deeper realization. Or, you know, so often someone will be like, oh my gosh, I realized when we had this conversation before, I said this thing and I was wondering, you know, and that time, it's, which feels so scary in the moment when we're activated in our bodies or in our emotions, giving that time, which feels like we can't afford, so often it ends up having that opposite effect, right? Of like, actually, with a little bit of space, I can see how that would affect you that way. Or, oh, I'm noticing that I was having a really strong reaction when we talked, and you know, I didn't really capture everything I feel about you or about us. Or even better, like, I came to you seeking advice, and then by you providing space, instead of me getting Annie's version of advice for me, I end up hearing myself answer my own question, which is like such a beautiful resource. It's such a beautiful resource to give each other, I think.
That part of listening that is also noticing perhaps where you can give someone even more space to be heard and open up more space for them to expand in another place.
Mm-hmm.
How do you practice that distinguishing? Because there are times where maybe one day we'll make a sketch comedy thing where we like make fun of this podcast by having it be like only 10 minutes of actually talking and the rest being us taking really long pauses in between and like doing like a kundalini practice and like getting back to the person. And
I have thought a few times like, well, maybe this would be better danced. And it's so challenging to give language to it. Like, and over here is
you do like a half verbal podcast maybe next time or one day.
the half verbal podcast is a great idea.
I'm in. How do you, in terms of timing, how do you distinguish? Tell me more about your practice with timing, with when to honor the flow of conversation that is and then you respond, and when to honor the flow of conversation that is, hold on, pause.
Mm-hmm. Oh, such a good question. Another one that I luckily don't or can't get the complete answer to. Thank you, complex universe. But I do, and you know, I think it's also an important one to bring up right now while we're being so many people are interacting virtually. One of the adjustments and oddities of this medium is that our timing is different, right? And we had to learn, or are still learning, how to notice if, okay, was that a connection breakdown or did you just pause? You know, is this an opening or not? The silence feels different. And so I guess that's one part of the answer, is that giving us space for there to be a different set of information depending on the medium. But I think a big part of it is my body awareness. And so that feeling of being cornered, that like constricted fight or flight, I feel like I have to respond right now. Simply asking myself the question, do I have to respond right now? And sometimes the answer is yes. You know, sometimes we do. And I don't want to minimize those moments of high intensity in our lives, because sometimes we just do. But I think they're pretty few and far between. And I think practicing noticing when my body is responding like that, like I have to take action right away. And instead, it's like a counteraction. Instead of acting from that place, actually doing the opposite and slowing down. So that's probably the clearest, most consistent indicator. And then I think there's also like a shared wordless language that emerges in each relationship that's really unique to that relationship. And so you begin, you know, just like how if you were forming a lovemaking relationship or a dance relationship or an artistic relationship with someone, you begin, if you're paying attention to them and listening to them, and including listening to what they're not saying, you know, listening to, oh, when I come at you first thing in the morning with a list of 10 things to do, you tend to shut down and get angry. You know, you don't seem to like that very much. So I could keep doing that, and, you know, maybe I need to for whatever reason, or I could find a different way to communicate with you that you're going to be able to receive. And so that is a part of it too. And that's where I think in therapy you end up forming a really unique connection with each person. And then same thing with our friends and our loved ones. And I just spent time with my family again relatively recently, and I felt like all those relationships got an update. And I think relationships need those updates where the edges are kind of rediscovered and redefined. And we're learning again and learning again and learning again how to be together. And sometimes shifting the boundaries or the expectations at first is really, I think, uncomfortable. Where, you know, if suddenly the Lauren who for a lot of my life was always immediately available and responsive is starting to practice saying, I'm going to sit on that for a minute. I'm not going to jump to action right away. That's changing the rules of engagement. It's going to most likely create a reaction in the other person, but it also creates a window of opportunity for things to be shifted, and so that I don't have to fold so much of myself away in protection. You know, I can put, you were saying about cells and how there's like this cushion of air around them, or even atoms. Mm-hmm. And in them, right? And those particles are moving so quickly. The air is protective. It's needed. I don't know if I answered your question, but I prefaced with saying it was unanswerable, so maybe I got out of it.
You did, and you brought up a really important point too of honoring uniqueness and individuality, and this part of emotional somatic experience that we can make themes. As someone who I know loves to make lists and themes of words and things, of we can make themes of things and words and talk about philosophizing of the human experience. And the other image that's come up like 3 times during recording this podcast is you in the library in college, like writing out, not poetry, writing out detailed philosophy papers, and that side of Lauren. As a little side note plug here, I gotta throw that in. The individuality that says emotional experience is individual, in that sure, there's themes, all humans feel sadness, all humans feel joy, And also, it is so personal and personalized to each human. And so, of course, in each connection, how I talk with you will be, yeah, there's themes and there's similarities with how I talk with other people. And it is unique to how I talk with you. And there's a uniqueness of each communicating, and same with ourselves and our own inner parts and how we talk to our individual inner parts and how those individual inner parts talk, and how to honor and celebrate that, and also give the space for it to evolve, and for, like you were sharing about brushing up against that edge with a person and together in whatever the kind of connecting is, and the vulnerability word and the shame and all of those words that say, can this be a place for us to actually come closer together in this space and grow together, because I can share more of myself. I can share a little bit more of this space rather than folding this thing in, or rather than creating these walls and this constriction from. And so much of this stuff is so cliche in such a fun way of like space and breath and opening, and it's fun to see the word overlaps that.
Yeah, our language reveals it. Yeah. Speaking of body awareness, I'm gonna put on chapstick. Take care of your bodies. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. You know, sometimes we're at the place of, and this has to do with your self-advocacy kind of questioning you were doing a little bit earlier in our conversation, and about giving too much rope and then feeling shortchanged or resentful, which I think is so common. Like that is a really relatable to me experience of that conversation with another person, and how I react when I feel someone else's needs and my own. But there is, I think, also a shared giving of space can be so powerful when we can say, I want to explore this with you, instead of I need you to know this, I need you to hear. And sometimes this is necessary. Like sometimes someone has not been open to exploring, or they haven't been hearing us, and so it does become about no-go zone. This is not a conversation. This is me taking care of myself and being safe. But so often we start with that out of fear that we will be violated. And there might have been a will from the other person, if invited to have something more exploratory, and how much relief that can bring both people. If it's not like, we're going to get to the bottom of this, or you have to take in what I say and I'm not open to what you say. It's just, hey, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this. I want to explore it with you. It takes so much of that pressure off. And just like air molecules, when you put a lot of pressure, they start moving faster, and there's heat and there's friction, and sometimes that's amazing and what's needed, but we feel like that so much of the time. And our media, our devices, the intensity of what's happening on the political and social stages, they like compress, they create this really intense heat. And you don't have to add a coolant to the air, you just have to open the walls up a little bit, and the molecules start slowing down on their own when they have more room. It's a molecule. You love molecules.
My inner science and spiritual nerds are loving these metaphors. They're so good. My Q aggression coming out at them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's fun too to get to see all the overlaps in communicating, and how the perspective shift too of having it be fun, having it be a tool, having it be an exploration, having it be a game,
Play.
Yeah. that can still honor and hold the space for social inequalities and inequities exist, and how can we support those, and how can we support the emotions and tangibly support in actions of the reality of the world, that there are people without food and all of this is real, and so is the experiencing your human experience.
And they're related. Go on, Annie.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, you go for it. Of how do then we explore that connection, and how do we honor, really, like I'm feeling like with what you brought up of the uniqueness of each communicating, and how you develop the style of how you dance with a partner in different senses.
Yeah.
Harness that as its own tool then to distribute resources, and the things that I personally get fiery about.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so two ways they're connected that I think you danced with in what you're saying. One of them being from a physiological standpoint, being able to move out of that activation and to settle some, to slip into our parasympathetic part of our nervous system, and to create a kind of natural rhythm between sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic settling. That motion is necessary for us to be able to think, and necessary for us to be able to socialize and be online. So if I'm in a fight or flight response, if I'm in a freeze response, if I'm just totally in reaction survival mode, the parts of my brain that can communicate and process social cues, or have empathy for you, or know to reach out for help, or give language to what I'm feeling and experiencing, like those. And it's a beautiful, important thing in our survival. I mean, if you're down to like facing the bear, that stuff's not as important. You just, if the body dies, game over, in at least in this sense. So that I'm not, it's such an important part of our minds and our bodies, but it's not just about luxuriating in self-care and feeling good all the time. It is, I actually think it's a critical resource to advocacy work, to coming up with new solutions to large problems, to being able to have discourse across difference, to being able to turn triggers into pieces of information that can guide the work we do in the world. I mean, to all of these things on a large scale, being able to settle our nervous system it's as important as making sure we get water and food and everything else. If activists aren't eating and drinking water and sleeping, they're going to hit a capacity limit. If no matter who you are, you need certain things, and I'd like to add to that space, to calm and to respond as not just, again, a luxury, even though it can feel like that, as a necessary part of any of that larger work. I don't remember the other. There was something else in what you said that I thought was really lovely, and I've lost it because this is the this is the dance we're in right now.
It'll come back around however it does. And also, I know for me, in terms of this kind of podcast philosophizing and psychologizing, that's not exactly the word I'm going for, the feeling of it and the experiencing of it, that there is a bound of how much time, or like at a certain point in podcasting, or at a certain point in a emotional conversation with a friend, that saying, okay, I need that pause now, like, of course, and giving ourselves the grace to be human and say, we're not going to be firing on all cylinders all the time. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm reminding myself here. I'm
bringing that up, solving my my anxiety.
Yeah, please. You brought up a hugely important point of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and also it being a circle, and the points that are, no amount of talk therapy is going to settle the nervous system of someone who doesn't have access to basic human needs, because you're going to be anxious and depressed if you cannot have those things met. it would be a strange central nervous system response not to, that would actually be what would need therapy to talk through of like, it makes sense to have those responses to being without basic needs. And you brought up to the point of opening up the conversation about what basic needs are, to say that this idea of Maslow's pyramid and the top being self-actualization and being able to regulate your central nervous system is also a basic human right. And
yes.
having those tools. And I'm again excited to think about and to know how much is out there of tapping and meditation videos on YouTube for free, and yoga and journaling exercises and things that are, through their actions of existing and being out there communicating non-verbally, that these tools are also human rights, and that this is a really important piece of things,
yes,
too, that we're doing here. And again, underscoring the reminder that nobody really knows the one answer, because there doesn't seem to be a one answer. Like, it isn't like one hit fix of all social things, apparently.
Whoops. Well, and it requires us, just like you couldn't build a human pyramid alone, right? It requires us to collaborate and to be in networks. There's a way in which everything is available to each individual, and in which we can't do it alone. And we can't, if there are answers to these questions, they emerge in the spaces between us and through living with someone. And that reminded me of the other thing that resonated, and maybe is full circle, we'll see. But so often people come to a loved one, to a therapist, to someone saying, this hurts, can you fix it? Fix it, or fix it. And I think the most honest answer is probably no, but I can accompany you. I can walk with you. I can be with you. I can encourage you to stand up and explore what's here and see what you find, see what we find.
We're all walking each other home.
Yes.
Walk there with you. And no, I cannot solve your problem for you. And in fact, that would create more problems between us.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I love the walking home metaphor, because so much of that is about wanting the person to feel safe. It's not even necessarily that like you plus me would be able to, but it just feels safer. And sometimes we have to walk things on our own, but if we're scared, we're overwhelmed, or in a lot of pain, to say, will you just stay with me? So often, I think what can arise in those spaces, it ends up resolving itself, or it moves, because life moves. It changes if we're not holding it so tightly. Yeah.
Love in a way so the person you love feels free. I'm only speaking in quotes now for the rest of it.
That is impressive. That would be very impressive. The things you're saying are things that never existed before you said them and couldn't without you. So thank you for saying them.
Even if I'm saying other people's words? What? Lauren.
There's a way this makes sense. Well, you're saying them in new contexts.
A timing reminder of it and what that might activate in somebody hearing it, or
Yes.
in both of our
Oh,
experiences
the
of it.
third. You brought it up in the beginning, but there's another communicating without words, right? We're both aware that we're not just having a conversation, we're sharing a conversation with listeners who aren't speaking right now, but who might be feeling things in their bodies. You might be feeling things in your bodies, and it might be touching parts that feel true. It might be rubbing you the wrong way, and you feel like that doesn't feel right. And all of that is valuable information and makes you a part of this conversation, even though we can't hear you. So that's that was such a good insight you had in the beginning. All the people who aren't heard that are part of the conversation right now.
We're all participating in it together, learning how to regulate ourselves. I'm reminded too, for some reason, this is how I want to close out this episode. I can picture walking up a hill with you somewhere and you're going off in the best of ways about regulating and self-regulating and the power behind regulating yourself, and then also the other side, which is the power that gets given away and the power that gets taken and manipulated by, for example, advertising and using psychology of preying on people's lack of internal validation to say buy this thing or buy that thing. And there's something in here related to that, regulating and advocating and participating, that I'd be curious what sort of connection you see between those things. I'm feeling this sort of overlap in those, and I'd love to hold hands and walk through the end of this podcast timing of how do those overlap? How do those come together?
Yeah. The first thing that came up to mind was how really being able to feel how you being able to self-resource and to self-regulate and to have more awareness of your body and your reactions and practice and give yourself the opportunity to take pause and be curious and not have to act right away. It's liberating. It is literally freedom. It is critical to freedom. Because if not, then we're going to be acting unconsciously and reactively, either based on how old patterns of ours want us to behave, which are there because at some point they made us safe, but maybe we're tired of them or they're hurting us. Or we're prone to having our nervous systems hijacked by, like you're saying, messages externally, something that's geared towards stimulating you and getting your engagement, not necessarily giving you truth or self-awareness. And so taking back those reins and feeling like you have the capacity and you have the awareness of your own body, your own feelings, your own sense of, well, is this right or wrong? Am I really feeling this right now or not? That is a form of, and maybe one of the most critical components of being genuinely free as a person. So I think that's maybe where the overlap you're feeling is, at least dancing around the freedom maypole.
Yes, that freedom word, and the intuition and trauma, and how freedom overlaps with perhaps distinguishing, is this trauma or is this intuition, and where am I to explore and how, and is this pain or is this discomfort, and where can I lean? Okay, I lied. I have one more final wrap up because I love your poetry and your words and your word even your prose is very poetic to me. You know the seas very intimately, like you know me, and the recap is going through consciousness to start with, being aware of our somatic, our feelings, and then choice, change, compassion to communication. I would love to hear a sentence or a couple of sentences from you about with those C's kind of in that flow-ish that feel tied to this podcast, this moment, this whatever, if you're open to gifting your word poetry. To make it too with like what a goofy irony where it's like no pressure, like of course the video just froze. Like no pressure, and also like really no pressure. Or like circle back and like message these to me later or never.
I'm getting the indirect communication that you would love this and are shy to ask me for it. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna.
Oh, I would so love this, and I would love it. I'm only
You don't
gonna
want me to feel pressure.
What?
I said, but maybe you don't want me to feel pressure, and I think there's a reason the C's. I think the C's for you were emergent. They weren't. You've kind of given top-down language to them, but they're connected naturally. So it doesn't feel like a hard tinkering. But I want to make sure. So you said consciousness. What was the second one? Choice. Change. Compassion. Communication. Yeah. Consciousness. Choice. Well, that first link is exactly what we were just talking about, is that having the illumination of consciousness, bringing consciousness to things. I just want to give a quick shout out to the unconscious and its own wily, wild process. Some things need to be baked out of extra long or need to hide for a bit and incubate. And so it's not necessarily about like rush in and shine consciousness on everything, but this sort of conversational, fluid uncovering of things as things become illuminated. And that's also important because things can become conscious at a rhythm that we can tolerate and we can really integrate them if we don't push too hard and we accept that we can't know everything right away or can't say everything right away. But once we have those things illuminated, it gives us so much more choice, right? I know what I'm working with. If I know there's a nail somewhere, but I am not sure where, and I just start hammering, I'm going to end up with a whole lot of holes in a wall. So think of it that way, that brute metaphor. So we go to choice and then change. Well, because anytime we can make a choice, we have this opportunity for change, right? We can break free of a repetition. We can make a different choice than the one we've always made or than the one that's being handed to us, which gives us an opportunity to change the rules of engagement with ourselves and with others, with the systems at large. Compassion. When we don't feel stuck, when it feels like we can make choices, when it feels like things can change and grow, which in order for something to change, there has to be receptiveness, there has to be responsiveness in the environment. And that opens us up to feeling compassion for ourselves. Oh, okay, I'm not this all the time. Or, oh, I now understand why I've been doing this and know I can make a different choice. Also, because I feel freer and more spacious, I can also understand where you're coming from and why you might have done what you did. And I love that communication comes so far down in the line because so often it feels like communication comes first in people's responses before the consciousness or the choice or any of that. We just feel like we have to react or respond. So having communication come there, it can emerge from compassion, from that awareness of you and me, and not just what I want to say and need to say, but who you are and how you're going to receive it and how I'm touching you with it, whatever kind of communication it is. So I think you felt a natural ribbon that you were tugging there, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
I love hearing your word poetry of it and going through and your psychological, analytical agreeing with those same things of.
Thank you. Thank you for asking and for carving out space for me to speak and speak about not speaking.
Thank you so much for coming on for a sec. I'm already silly excited about whenever our third podcast happens.
Yeah, it's interesting to see where we'll be. Yeah, it ends up being like these bookmarks their time. Yeah.
To check in. I really appreciate you making space and getting to have this check-in where you are in your life, in your program, in all of your things. And I thank you for modeling the pause too, and for being someone who lives it. And part of this conversation feeling so good to me is that feeling the experience and the time and energy, thoughts, feelings you've given to the practice of pause.
Back at you. We did it together. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for making it easy for more of my mush to come out publicly.
The world needs more of the mush. It means that their mush feels more beautiful and worthy of coming out too. So
The mush in me sees and acknowledges.
the mush in me sees and acknowledges the mush in you.
Lauren.
Till next time.
Until next time. Thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in. Please
Thank you.
talk to us. I'm going to put all the information of Angela's psychology group and Lauren's page, and where you can find some of Lauren's poetry and all the things. So I'd love to hear any feedback, and please reach out to Lauren if you are interested in a session and more learning. And thanks for being you.